Quad66. So I'm continuing this 1S motor shootout, so for 3-inch props. And in this comparison, I'm doing the Hyperlight, so Pyrodrone Hyperlight 1103.5 motor with 12,000 kV. So that's clearly a slightly taller motor, but narrower motor. And in this round, comparing them to the FPVcycle motor, the 13 motor, so the big wide pancake motor. And I think it's a 1302.75, somebody mentioned in the comments. And I thought this comparison is actually really interesting because these motors are different enough, they're kind of clearly different enough to where they've got two different applications. So to start off with, the Hyperlight motor, it's a slightly lighter motor. And so this build here, although I can trim down wire and things like that, it comes in a gram lighter than the build with the FPVcycle motor. And that's not a huge amount, but the weight is also out on the ends, and it's also rotating mass. So that does make some difference in terms of the way this is going to fly. This motor, not super notchy. And in terms of flight performance, where this motor shines is that it's got a pretty decent top end, and it's an efficient motor. Compared to the FPVcycle motor, on the Hyperlights, I'm picking up a minute of flight time. So that's actually quite a bit. It's not just a little difference where you're like going back and forth. You're like, maybe it was just the way I was flying. No, this motor is clearly, it's keeping the quad up in the air longer. And so if you're looking for a longer flight, these carry that, the red label GNB is a 720 milliamp cell. They carry that weight okay. And that with that battery, it's not hard to get this flight out over 6 minutes of flight time, which is pretty impressive. Where these motors differ, though, is in a couple other areas which are good and bad. So other good areas where they differ, so obviously the efficiency is better. They're quieter. These are like, this here is like the stealth build. This, not that any 1S 3-inch build is going to be loud, but this is the absolute stealth build. These motors are just kind of whisper along. And up at the top end of the throttle, they actually do pretty well. When you're punching out, they feel like they keep pulling, and once you've got the motor spun up, they feel pretty good. So overall, kind of an interesting thing of if you're flying either kind of more open spaces, or if you're looking for more flight time, or if you're looking for kind of just the quietest thing out there, these motors are really have a nice kind of niche for that. Where they really differ from the FPVcycle motor is the FPVcycle motor, it does those things in small areas that I do look for. So these motors clearly have more torque down low. There's a little bit of, once you get like really down low in the throttle range on the Hyperlights, there's a little bit of fall off. There's a little spool up down there. Versus the FPVcycle motors just stay really solid in the low throttle range. And when you're flying tight spaces, that really does make a difference. These FPVcycle motors are clearly easier to fly in tight spaces. And there's just a trade-off there where you're going to give up a little bit of efficiency, because this motor is a real nice notchy motor. That's how I like the motors to be. It's real nice notchy. I like getting all the torque and power I can out of the weight down low. And this makes for a really nice flying quad at the low end. These motors do also, when you compare them to the Hyperlight, they sound different in air. They've got a little growl to them. It's not like rattling bushings or anything like that. It's just the way it's producing the power. Maybe it's like a little bit of the cogging you're hearing, but it's got a little growl. And not that it's going to upset the neighbors, but if you're looking for absolute stealth, the Hyperlight's a slightly better choice. Not that the FPVcycle motor is loud. I personally kind of like the way these sound. So now, where these motors kind of like feel a little bit odd, not odd is the right word, but the power down low is so good and so linear that when you punch out with this motor, it's kind of interesting that the Hyperlight, it kind of builds power and builds into it, and it feels like it pulls a little bit more freely at the top end, versus the FPVcycle motor feels a little bit restricted. So the power comes on so early, so low, that when you get into the top end of the range, not that it's a bad punch out, not that it's slow, but it just feels restricted. You kind of like with these little brushless motors and the props, normally the power kind of comes in and it keeps pulling up to the top, versus these sort of give up a little bit. They just feel like, I don't know, they spin out maybe or whatever they do, but they're not that they're slow, but it's just that once you get up into that top end range, they feel a little restricted versus the motors that kind of keep pulling. And that may be a little bit of a relative difference here because of the lack of linearity of the thrust of these motors down to low end. So, but anyways, I thought that was kind of an interesting comparison because these motors are clearly different enough to where we're not just splitting hairs here. They're different enough to where I think you really have two different cases, and for different issues, one motor is clearly superior to the other. So if you're all about performance at low speeds, being able to, so like for example, when you're coming out of a dive and catching that dive, going into like tight figure eights or things like that, the FPVcycle motor at the low end is just, it's hands down superior. On the other hand, if you're in slightly more open spaces, or if you're looking at chasing flight time, or if you're chasing kind of that ultimate stealth quad, then this Hyperlight motor really is a quite nice motor for that regards. One other little last detail I'm just kind of remembering now. The prop fitment is kind of loose on these Hyperlight motors, so you need the nylon screws on there, versus the FPVcycle motors. With drilling out these props, these have been doing well where I haven't been needing prop screws. All right, so the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change out the FPVcycle motors, throw the flywoos on there, and I'm going to do the comparison to the Hyperlight to the flywoo, and that'll kind of round out that comparison and give us all three of those back-to-back direct comparisons, and we'll make some conclusions, some final conclusions at that point in time. All right, until next time, cheers.